Greetings, another lovely morning, a little dark here still. In this video we're going to be talking about Proxmox and setting up a user, well, a new user. Anyways, here in the Philippines February is almost gone and we're working our way towards March, so we're going to start getting into the hot weather here. Hoping it stays cool up here in Tagaytay. It's been a little warmer the last couple of days, but nothing like down in the valley, so. There's the clock. 5 o'clock. 5 in the morning. Okay, let's get going with this video now. So in this go around we're going to be using Proxmox. It's a virtual machine server and we're going to be looking at creating users. We took a look at the interface, we took a look at the install, I made some commentary on whether you actually need this or not in past videos, but if you're interested you can go watch them. But like I say, this time around we're going to be talking about how to create a user. This series of videos is not really a tutorial, it's more an overview, so I'm going to be basically discussing my concept of users in Proxmox, and we're going to walk through a few experiments I've been playing around with just to see what happens when you do various combinations of user things in Proxmox. And the hope is this will give everyone some more familiarity with the interface and with the steps needed to create that user in Proxmox. And that's just the next step in the process. After that we'll have to look at storage, then we'll look at actually creating virtual machines or containers. So off we go. So let's get right to the subject at hand. Proxmox user authentication is basically what I'm calling it. So users in Proxmox are kind of an interesting bag. Well, you'll see as we get into it, it's not really quite as simple as using, say, Cockpit to be your virtual machine manager. First thing to understand about users is there's many different types. First type we're going to talk about is what we're going to call the PVE user, or Proxmox Virtual Environment User. These are internal to the Proxmox cluster, which we talked about and we went over the display, and we talked about the levels inside of Proxmox. This is internal to the cluster. It's not a node user, and it's based within the cluster. This is, well, we'll see when we get around to creating it. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Our next user type is going to be the PAM, or Pluggable Authentication Module. This is your basic Linux user. The basic install of Proxmox sits on top of a Debian Linux installation, and PAM is the user authentication module used in Linux, specifically in Debian. To use this, it requires users exist on all nodes within a cluster, and authentication is based on existing computer user with password as set up on that computer, or aka the node in the cluster, and it has to be set up on all nodes. LPDA, or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, is another method of authenticating users. To use this with Proxmox, you have to set it up. It assumes access to a DSA, or Directory System Agent server, which would be where you'd authenticate your users. And again, basically it'll have to be the same across all nodes within the cluster. AD is Active Directory. This is the Microsoft domain controller user authentication. It assumes you're part of a Windows domain. And if that's the case, then you could use this one to authenticate users. I don't know if I was clear, but authenticating users is when they log in and they give you a password, or other methods of authentication, which we'll talk about. OpenID assumes authentication via an external oath to. I am not really familiar with this particular method at all. I've never used it, so it's there. I just don't know a lot about it. So we've got all these methods. These are known as realms in Proxmoxese or Proxmox talk. And if you take a look at this small diagram here, Proxmox cluster authentication. This is PVE. This is within the Proxmox cluster. And if we go down, we can see each of the nodes within the cluster has a PAM module if we're using the base install on Debian Linux. And PAM authentication would have to be at the node level. You'd set it up in the cluster, but it would be at the node level, and each node will need to be the same, have the same users. This is okay if you've got a couple of nodes, but if you start getting 4, 5, 6, 7 nodes, this can become a royal pain in the rear, so to speak. So the LDPA, AD, and OpenID, on the other hand, use a single server or single source somewhere outside of the Proxmox cluster. And for lots of nodes, they're probably the easier method to use, but they, like I say, they got to be set up externally. It's not a component that comes with Proxmox. So again, PVE within the cluster, PAM on each of the node computers, LD, PA, AD, and OpenID are external. On our base install, we're only going to have PVE and PAMs because we do not have an external validation or authentication source with this cluster I'm setting up. A couple things to consider here. When creating users, you can give permission directly to users. I prefer to use group permissions instead of user permissions. That way, when I create a user, I just assign the correct groups to them for what they're supposed to be able to do. My guess is on your home LAN, you will most likely be the only Proxmox user. In such case, if you feel comfortable with it, feel free to use the root account that's built into Proxmox when you start up. Otherwise, you're going to need to create groups with appropriate permissions and a non-root user to do some tasks. If your LANs are outside of the home, this might require additional users for various tasks. Again, like I say, if you're on a personal LAN in the home, you're probably going to be the only Proxmox user. Just because someone needs access to a virtual machine or a container on Proxmox does not mean they need actual access to either Proxmox or the nodes themselves, just the containers. So you need to put a little thought into who has actual access to the Proxmox server. Which is why I say if it's on a home LAN, you're probably going to be it. At least I'm it here because no one else is really interested in doing it. But yeah, give a little thought to who you're actually allowing to use the Proxmox software. All right, enough theorizing. Let's get around to actually playing around, okay? Let's log into our cluster. I'm going to log into my cluster. Logging in as a root user. And you can see this is pretty much the same as it was last time we were here. We've got our data center and we've got our 2 nodes. I talked about the issues with having 2 nodes. I'm not really worried about it in this case. If we go ahead and look in our nodes and our password files, we'll see we have our root user but no other user. And this should be the same on both nodes. So the only PAM authorized user we have right now is our root account. If we go up to our data center node, under permissions, we can find various menu options for users. Let's talk about realms first. By default, you have PAM and PVE only. because that's what's here. If you want to add a new realm, you need to go up here, and you're going to notice you're going to need specific things like a server name. And what you're going to need is going to depend on the type of external authentication you want to use. We'll just take a quick look at all these again. Server name, base domain name, various things like that. You need to set up the authentication method if it's external. This is the one I've never used before, but yeah, it still requires some external stuff like issue or URL. Okay, so Realm sync jobs I haven't used yet or played around with. Once we get things set up, I will probably play around with these and come back and visit them later. So we've got basically our two realms, PVE and PAM. Now we can go, the next one up is the roles. Proxmox has a lot of built-in roles. You can see them all here. You can assign these roles to either users or groups. Note we can't edit any of the pre-existing roles, but we can create new roles. And those we should be able to edit. That's a little more in depth, probably more than most people are going to want to do. Haven't played around a lot with pools yet. That's another area I need to get into. Groups. This is where we define our groups. And like I say, I usually do groups. You give it a name. And you give it a comment. And you will notice we're not adding passwords, permissions, or anything at this point. This just defines a group. So you can create as many groups as you want. But again, there's no permissions or access or anything like that with any of these groups. They're just existing here. So above that we have two-factor authentication. There are various methods available if you're going to use it. Otherwise it's strictly password, single factor, I guess you'd call it. Or if you're using a security token, you'd add that here. Here we can define our users. Remember, we're all at the Prox data center level here too, so we'll give a username. This is PAM. Note there's no space for a password when you're using PAM. This is assuming that it's an already existing user someplace and we're just using a verification service of some sort. Now, if you notice we go to a PVE user, you're going to have passwords that you need to enter because this is internal to the Proxmox server. So yes, you need to enter a password in this case. And we can assign a group to the user, and there's our second user. Our first user didn't have a group. So we'll come back to permissions. Let's go ahead and try and log in as a user. This is our PVE user who's validated within Proxmox itself. You see we can log in even though we do not have much that we can do because said user has no administrative access of any kind. All right, let's try our PAM user. Since we created this user without a password because he doesn't exist in our nodes yet, you can see we just cannot log in. So let's log back in as root. Oh, oops, got to change my mode back to PAM because root's a PAM user. And there we go. So if we go to our node, we have no user stuff in the menu here, so we need to go to the shell, use user add, TACM creates the home directory and our username. That creates a user. Then we need to give them a password that we can actually use to log in with. Okay, important concept here. We're going to log back out. We're going to log in as RT. It's Linux PAM Authentication. We got our password. And whammo, login failed. The login failed because we're only validated in one of our nodes. The user only exists in the PAM database in one node. We need to add them to the other node or we're never going to be able to log in. Like I say, if you've got lots of nodes, you might want to consider one of the external authentication methods rather than PAM, because it can be a real pain in the ass to modify a whole bunch of PAM databases on multiple nodes. So you can see here are the users in this list, but it wasn't in the previous list. So let's go ahead and add them here to our second node. All right, that's done. Now let's try that login again. And there we go. Again, we don't have a lot of permissions here, but we can log in. Let's log back in as root and fix the permissions issue, I think. That should be the next test. All right. So, first thing, let's give some permission to groups, since that's the way I like to do it. We're going to use a / for the whole directory tree. Group is admin with administrative access, and there we have permission set to that group. Now we're going to edit this user and we're going to add the group admin. Okay. Now let's log out and log back in as RT. That's retired techie, by the way, if you didn't know. And look at that, now we can do some stuff. However, note that we're not logged in to the node because this is a normal user, it's not root user, so you're going to have to do the login here yourself, or else go in and assign him root permissions in the node, which is another video altogether. But now we actually have a secondary user. I can play around with permissions a little with what I want him to be able to do and not do. Again, we have to log back into our nodes, which not a big deal. I mean, if we gave this guy administrative permissions on the node with its groups and permissions, yeah, then might not have to log back in. But we can also add sudo and/or su we can use to actually get root permissions at this level. Oops, Fat fingers, fat fingers. Oh. Keep forgetting these consoles don't actually work like an actual SSH session. Like using PuTTY or something. You don't have all the keyboard commands, but you get used to that. One thing I noticed here, so we've got a KVM group, which is your kernel virtual machine module. Oh, stop that. But you will notice there is no libvirt group. That was just something kind of interesting I noticed while playing around. So Proxmox is taking the place of libvirt, but KVM is still there. And you notice there's no group members in KVM either. It's kind of interesting. It also explains a few things about the way Proxmox is set up and the way it operates. Also did some poking around in the SSH server directory, and if you go into the sshd_config file, you can find where the root is given permission to log in via SSH, and that's where you go if you wanted to change that to non-root login that way. But we're not going to worry about that at this particular time. Yeah, I did a little poking around the SSH files, kind of interesting. Anyway, that's pretty much what you need to understand about users. All right, there we have it. That's the Proxmox users in a condensed quick version. I'm hoping it helps you understand how the user setup works. It can be a little confusing with the realms, external users, PAM users, PVE users. Yeah, a lot of choices there, but I'm hoping you now understand what your choices are, and depending on your situation, you can figure out the best method for your user authentication in your instance. I also talk a little bit about if it's a home Proxmox server, you're probably going to be the only person who actually needs access, in which case this is all kind of trivial and not very important. Like I say, it does become important when you get into a larger environment where you're in, I guess, dedicated or critical services, and you do need to have multiple users available. Then yeah, a lot of this stuff becomes important. If you're comfortable with it, you can just go with what Proxmox sets up by default. Like I say, if it's on your home LAN, security is not that big an issue. I'm assuming you know who's on your LAN. In my case, it's not hard. We don't have any houses for 2 property blocks around us, so if anybody gets close enough to use my LAN, the dogs will, or my Wi-Fi, I should say, the dogs will set up a fit, and I'll know they're there. But yeah, so like I say, in my case, security is not a big issue. I could technically use a root account. I probably will for this series. It's just, on a fundamental level, I'm sort of uncomfortable with using root when you don't need to use root, and that is one of my complaints about Proxmox, is it's set up to use root exclusively. I've read that there's some things you can't do unless you're logged in as root, but I've yet to find something I can't do with a user who has full administrative access. We'll see as we go along. I'm sure I'll find other stuff. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Yeah, that's it. And we'll see you next time, okay?